Across the golden sands of West Africa, where the blazing sun kisses the horizon and the Niger River bends like a silver serpent through the land, there once rose a kingdom of unimaginable wealth and power. The Mali Empire, a civilization whose very name became a whisper of gold, knowledge, and glory across the medieval world. This was not just a kingdom. It was a dream, carved into reality by visionaries who built cities where books were more precious than jewels, and markets overflowed with riches that stunned travelers from distant lands. At its height, Mali shone brighter than the castles of Europe, richer than the bazaars of Arabia, and more learned than the libraries of the East. But like all great empires, its story is not just of triumph, it is also of betrayal, ambition, and the endless struggle of human destiny. Tonight, we journey into the heart of Africa's Golden Empire to uncover the forgotten history of kings and scholars, warriors and merchants whose legacy still echoes in the soil, the music and the spirit of West Africa. This is the story of the Mali Empire. History. The story of the Mali Empire begins long before its golden age, in the dust and shadow of kingdoms that came before it. West Africa was not a land of silence or emptiness. It was alive with trade, faith, and power. Before Mali, there was Ghana, the great Seninke kingdom that dazzled the world with its vast reserves of gold and iron. It was here that the foundations of African empire building were laid, where caravans of camels marched across the Sahara bearing salt, ivory, and the promise of riches. But by the 11th century, Ghana's brilliance began to fade. Drought, political rivalries, and waves of foreign invaders gnawed at its strength, leaving space for new powers to rise. Out of this turbulence, in a land of farmers and hunters along the upper Niger River, a people known as the Mandinka began to gather. They were not yet the masters of Africa's destiny, but their stories, whispered around campfires, spoke of a hero who would one day unite them. A crippled boy scorned by his peers, destined to become a lion among men. This was the beginning of the legend of Sundiata Keita, the man who would forge Mali from ashes into gold. Sundiata's story is the stuff of epic poetry, immortalized in the famous epic of Sundiata, recited by griots, keepers of memory in West African culture. According to legend, he was born weak, unable to walk until the age of 7, mocked by those around him, but blessed with an indomitable spirit. When his father, a local king, was overthrown and his people scattered, Sundiata went into exile. For years he wandered, gathering allies, learning the ways of war and politics. And when the time was right, he returned to claim his destiny. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Kirina in 1235, where Sundiata's Mandinka forces clashed with the mighty Soso kingdom, led by the fearsome king Samaro Kanti. Against all odds, Sundiata triumphed, defeating Sumaro and uniting the fragmented clans under a single banner. In the aftermath of victory, he proclaimed the birth of a new empire, the Mali Empire, forged in blood, bound by kinship, and destined to become one of the greatest civilizations the world had ever seen. Under Sundiata's leadership, Mali was more than just a conquest. It became a vision of order and unity. He established the Gabara, a grand assembly of nobles, generals, and clan leaders, where voices from across the empire could be heard. This was not democracy in the modern sense, but it was a system of governance that balanced power, allowed for consultation, and bound together the diverse peoples of West Africa under a common law. Sundiata also understood the importance of faith. Islam had already spread through the region by merchants and scholars, but traditional beliefs still held deep roots among the Mandinka. Rather than force one over the other, Sundiata blended both worlds, allowing Islam to flourish while respecting the ancestral spirits that gave his people identity. In this way, Mali was not just a kingdom, it was a tapestry, woven with threads of tradition and innovation, of spiritual depth and worldly ambition. The empire's foundations rested on land that was as rich as its people were ambitious. The fertile valleys of the Niger River gave Mali its heartland, producing grain and sustaining villages. Beyond these valleys lay untapped richest vast gold mines in Bambouk, Bure, and Galam, rivers that carried trade and forests that hid ivory and kola nuts. To the north stretched the Sahara Desert, a barrier that was also a gateway. For centuries, Berber and Arab merchants had carried goods across its endless dunes, linking sub-Saharan Africa with North Africa and beyond. Under Mali, these routes were secured, expanded, and protected. Gold flowed northward to markets in Cairo, Tunis, and Marrakesh, while salt precious as life itself was brought southward in return. This exchange was not merely economic. It was cultural, binding Mali into the wider world, giving it a role on the stage of global history. By the time Sundiata passed from this world in the mid-13th century, he had left behind not just a kingdom, but a legend. His people called him the Lion King of Mali, a ruler who rose from frailty to greatness, whose will transformed scattered clans into an empire that stretched from the Atlantic coast to the edge of the Sahara. His descendants, the Keita dynasty, would carry his legacy forward, ruling over one of the largest and wealthiest empires in medieval history. Yet, even as the griots sang his praises, the true brilliance of Mali was still to come. Ahead lay an era of unimaginable riches, of kings whose names would be remembered across oceans, of cities that would rival Baghdad and Cairo. The world had not yet seen Mali at its height, and when it did, it would never forget as the 13th century gave way to the 14th. The Mali Empire grew far beyond the dreams of its founder. Sundiata's heirs inherited not only his throne but also his vision of a kingdom built on strength, wealth, and prestige. One by one, rival chiefdoms and neighboring kingdoms were drawn into Mali's orbit, some by diplomacy, others by force. The empire stretched like a golden tapestry across West Africa, from the lush forests of the south to the windswept dunes of the north, encompassing dozens of ethnic groups and countless communities. But in this vast realm, it was not only military might that held sway was gold. Mali's goldfields became the beating heart of the empire, fueling an economy so dazzling that merchants from Europe, the Middle East, and Asia all spoke in awe of the riches flowing out of Africa's interior. In this golden age, Mali was not an isolated kingdom at the edge of the world. It was the very center of it, among the early rulers who carried Mali's torch. Mansa Musa, the son of Sundiata, solidified the empire's foundations. He expanded Mali's reach, extending influence into Gao and securing vital trade routes. It was under his reign that Mali began to embrace Islam more formally, integrating Quranic law alongside traditional customs. But it was not until the reign of the legendary Mansa Musa, nearly a century later, that Mali would truly burst into the imagination of the wider world. Mansa Musa, ascending the throne in 1312, inherited a realm already wealthy. He transformed it into an empire without equal. Under his watch, Mali controlled an estimated half of the world's known gold reserves. His armies patrolled trade routes, his governors administered distant provinces, and his merchants carried Mali's name across the Sahara and beyond. In every corner of the known world, whispers began. Who was this African king? Richer than any emperor of Europe, more powerful than any caliph of Arabia? The answer came in 1324, when Mansa Musa undertook one of the most famous journeys in human history, his pilgrimage to Mecca, the Hajj. Setting out with an entourage so vast it seemed endless, Musa traveled across the Sahara and into the heart of North Africa, dazzling every city he passed. Chroniclers wrote that he was accompanied by tens of thousands of attendants, soldiers, and servants, with camels carrying hundreds of pounds of pure gold. In Cairo, he distributed so much wealth and gifts and charity that he reportedly destabilized the local economy, causing gold prices to crash for years. To the astonished eyes of the Mediterranean world, Musa was no longer just a king. He was a legend, the embodiment of Africa's hidden riches. Maps soon began to depict Mali as a land of gold, with artists sketching Musa as a crowned figure holding a gleaming nugget, seated on a throne at the very center of the world. But Musa's legacy was not measured in gold alone. On his return from the Hajj, he brought back architects, scholars, and artists, determined to transform Mali into a beacon of learning and faith. In the city of Timbuktu, he sponsored the construction of mosques, palaces, and the famed Sankar University, which would become one of the greatest centers of scholarship in Africa. There, scholars copied manuscripts, debated philosophy, and taught generations of students in subjects ranging from theology to astronomy, law to medicine. Books became a prized commodity, traded at higher value than gold or ivory, and Timbuktu earned a reputation as a city of knowledge, rivaling the intellectual capitals of the Islamic world. In this golden age, Mali was not merely wealthy, was enlightened. It was a civilization where the material treasures of Africa were matched by the brilliance of human thought, a realm where power and wisdom walked hand in hand. By the time of Mansa Musa's death in 1337, Mali stood at the zenith of its glory. It was a land of vast territories, stretching thousands of kilometers, its wealth unmatched, its cities thriving with merchants, scholars, and travelers from distant lands. Musa's reign had placed Mali firmly on the map of history, not as a footnote, but as a giant. Yet greatness always carries within it the seeds of fragility. Behind the glittering facade of wealth, challenges simmered. Vast empires are hard to control. Rival factions nursed ambitions, and distant provinces chafed under central rule. After Musa's passing, Mali would struggle to hold together the immense legacy he had built. The empire would endure, but storms were gathering on the horizon, and the golden glow of Mali's supremacy would, in time, begin to fade. The death of Mansa Musa marked not the end of the Mali Empire, but the beginning of a slow unraveling. His successors inherited an empire of dazzling wealth and sprawling territories, yet they lacked his vision, charisma, and iron grip on power. At first, Musa's son Mansa Musa attempted to carry the mantle, but he was soon overshadowed by the challenges of governing so vast a realm. Provinces on the periphery began to drift. Rival generals questioned the authority of the crown, and the once unified empire showed cracks. Still, Mali endured through much of the 14th century, for its gold and trade remained irresistible to the outside world. Caravans still crossed the desert, scholars still gathered in Timbuktu, and griots still sang the praises of the Keita dynasty. But within the heart of the empire, the bonds that had once held Mali together began to loosen, and the brilliance of its golden age slowly dimmed. The greatest threat came not only from within, but also from without. To the east, a new power was rising, the Songhai, based in the city of Gao, a trading hub once under Mali's control. The Songhai people had long lived under Mali's shadow, paying tribute to the empire, but as Mali weakened, their ambition grew. In the late 14th and early 15th centuries, Songhai leaders began to assert their independence, capturing trade routes and expanding their armies. At the same time, incursions from nomadic groups in the north and rival kingdoms in the south strained Mali's resources. The empire that had once stretched from the Atlantic coast to the Sahara was now fighting for survival on multiple fronts. For every province Mali lost, the aura of invincibility that had surrounded the empire since the days of Sundiata and Musa faded a little more. Inside the empire, politics grew bitter and unstable. Successions were contested, with rival claimants to the throne plunging the empire into civil strife. The once mighty Gabara Council, which had served as a unifying body under Sundiata, became mired in factionalism, as power shifted back and forth between warring rulers. Ordinary people bore the brunt of instability, farmers unable to plant their crops in peace, merchants forced to pay bribes to travel safely, and scholars watching as the libraries of Timbuktu fell into neglect. The empire's reputation as a beacon of wealth and knowledge endured in the outside world for a time. But within Mali, life was becoming harsher. Even the griots, the traditional keepers of history, began to sing songs tinged with lament, remembering the golden days of Mansa Musa as a dream slipping further into the past by the 15th century. Mali's decline was clear. The Songhai Empire rose to dominance, capturing Timbuktu in 1433 and seizing control of vital trade networks. Mali was pushed back, its territories shrinking like water retreating from the desert sands. Yet the empire did not vanish overnight. For more than a century, the Keita dynasty clung to remnants of its power, ruling over a reduced kingdom that still commanded respect, if not fear. Traders still came to its markets, scholars still found refuge in its mosques, and the memory of its golden age gave the people a sense of pride. But the Mali of Sundiata and Musa was gone, replaced by a weakened remnant overshadowed by new empires rising from its ashes. The torch of West African supremacy had passed from Mali to Songhai, just as Mali had once inherited it from Ghana by the early 17th century. The Mali Empire was little more than a shadow of its former self, pressed on all sides by powerful neighbors and unable to maintain control over its fragmented territories. The once great empire finally collapsed. Its fall was not a sudden event, but a long fading. A gradual loss of power that ended with its lands absorbed by rival kingdoms and invading forces. Yet even in decline, Mali's legacy endured. The songs of the griots preserved the memory of Sundiata, the Lion King who forged a nation. The chronicles of Arab historians remembered Mansa Musa, the golden monarch who dazzled the world. And the ruins of Timbuktu's libraries still whispered of a time when West Africa stood at the pinnacle of wealth and learning. Mali's empire had fallen, but its spirit remained etched into the identity of West Africa. A reminder that history is not only written in stone, but also in memory, culture, and song. Culture. The Mali Empire was not only a kingdom of wealth and armies, it was a civilization of spirit, imagination, and tradition. At its core were the Mandinka people, whose language, customs, and values provided the foundation of Mali's cultural identity. The Mandinka tongue, part of the broader Mande language family, became the unifying voice of the empire, spoken in markets, royal courts, and villages alike. It was through this language that the empire's laws were declared, its poetry sung, and its stories passed down. Yet, Mali was not homogeneous. Its vastness encompassed many ethnic groups: Fulani herders, Songhay traders, Songhai River people, and Tuareg nomads. Each brought their own traditions, weaving a cultural mosaic under the empire's banner. What made Mali unique was its ability to harmonize this diversity, allowing cultures to coexist while fostering a shared identity. Mali was not just an empire of borders, was an empire of voices, each one contributing to a chorus that resonated across centuries. Central to Mali's cultural life were the griots, the storytellers, poets, and musicians who carried the empire's memory. They were more than entertainers. They were living libraries, guardians of history, who preserved genealogies, recounted battles, and celebrated heroes through song. The griot's kora, a 21-stringed harp lute, echoed across Mali's villages, its melodies mingling with the voices of singers who recited epics like that of Sundiata. In a world without written records for most common people, the griots ensured that Mali's past would not be forgotten. Their words were power, shaping how generations understood their identity and values. Even kings revered the griots, for to be remembered in their songs was to live forever. Long after the fall of Mali, these oral traditions continued, bridging the ancient empire with the modern world. The griots made culture immortal, carrying the soul of Mali across time. Religion, too, played a vital role in shaping Mali's cultural landscape. Islam had already spread into West Africa by the time of Sundiata, carried by merchants and scholars from North Africa. Under rulers like Mansa Musa, it became deeply rooted in the empire, influencing law, education, and architecture. Great mosques rose in Timbuktu, Gao, and Djenné, their mud brick walls adorned with wooden beams that reached skyward like fingers pointing to the heavens. Yet, traditional spiritual practices endured alongside Islam. People still honored ancestral spirits, performed rituals to ensure good harvests, and invoked the guidance of nature. This blending of Islam with indigenous beliefs created a cultural balance, unique to Mali's spiritual world, where the Quran coexisted with sacred groves. And where faith was not a division, but a bridge, festivals in the Mali Empire reflected this harmony of faith, tradition, and community. Islamic holidays such as Eid al-Fitr and Eid al-Adha were celebrated with grandeur feasts of rice, millet, and roasted meats, prayers in open courtyards, and the giving of alms to the poor. At the same time, local festivals rooted in the seasons or harvests continued to thrive. Villages gathered for dances that lasted through the night, with drummers setting rhythms that seemed to echo the heartbeat of the earth. Masks carved from wood embodied spirits of ancestors or forces of nature, worn by dancers whose movements blurred the lines between the human and the divine. These festivals were not mere entertainments. They were sacred expressions of Mali's connection to life, death, and renewal. Architecture also told the story of Mali's culture. The empire became famous for its Sudano-Sahelian style, a unique form of building that used sun-baked mud bricks reinforced with wooden beams. The most iconic example remains the Great Mosque of Djenné, a masterpiece of African Islamic architecture that still stands today. Its smooth, sculpted walls and towering minarets were not only places of worship, but symbols of community pride, maintained each year by entire villages who gathered to replaster the walls. Palaces and marketplaces followed similar designs, blending practicality with aesthetic harmony. These structures were more than just buildings. They were statements of identity, resilience, and creativity. In every mosque, market, and home, the spirit of Mali's culture lived, etched into clay and stone, whispered in prayers, and celebrated in music. At the heart of Mali's cultural glory was knowledge. Nowhere was this more evident than in Timbuktu, which during the empire's height became one of the most celebrated intellectual centers of the medieval world. Scholars from across North Africa, the Middle East, and even Europe traveled to its bustling streets, drawn by its libraries and universities. The Sankore University, along with the Jingerbur and Sidi Yahya madrasas, formed a triumvirate of learning where students could spend years studying law, astronomy, philosophy, and medicine. Manuscripts were meticulously copied by hand, written in Arabic script on parchment, and traded at values higher than gold itself. These texts covered everything from the Quran and Islamic jurisprudence to mathematics and herbal medicine. In a time when much of Europe still struggled through the shadows of the Middle Ages, Timbuktu was a beacon of scholarship, where wisdom was both a commodity and a treasure of the soul. Beyond scholarship, Mali's literary and artistic culture thrived through the fusion of oral and written traditions. While the griots carried the living memory of Mali in epic poems and songs, the scholars of Timbuktu preserved knowledge in written form, ensuring its endurance beyond the spoken word. Stories of Sundiata's rise, Mansa Musa's pilgrimage, and the struggles of Mali's people became cultural anchors passed down through centuries. Artistic expression was woven into daily life patterns in textiles, designs etched into jewelry, and intricate carvings in wood and ivory. Each motif carried meaning, often symbolizing protection, fertility, or the blessings of ancestors. In this way, Mali's art was never just decorative, was storytelling made visible. A dialogue between the living and the spiritual world. The cuisine of Mali, reflected the empire's abundance and its role as a crossroads of trade. The fertile valleys of the Niger River produced rice, millet, sorghum, and beans, staples of the Malian diet. Fish from the Niger's waters, cattle and goats from the savannas, and fruits from the forests enriched the tables of both peasants and kings. Trade introduced exotic flavors, dates from North Africa, salt from the Sahara, and spices from distant lands, making Malian cuisine a reflection of its global connections. Meals were more than nourishment. They were communal experiences shared from large bowls as families and communities gathered. Hospitality was considered sacred. To welcome a guest with food was to honor both them and the ancestors, and the act of sharing a meal symbolized unity and trust. Dress in the Mali Empire was another reflection of status, identity, and artistry. Common people often wore garments made from woven cotton or raffia, dyed with earthy tones from natural pigments. The wealthier classes adorned themselves with fabrics brought along trade routes, fine silks, indigo-dyed cloth, and embroidered tunics. Gold jewelry, often shaped into intricate designs, was a mark of both wealth and spiritual protection. Headdrops and turbans were common, serving not only as practical shields against the West African sun, but also as markers of dignity and respect. Clothing, like food and music, was a language of its own, a way of communicating status, devotion, and pride in one's heritage through attire. The Malians expressed their connection to both tradition and the broader world that their empire touched. Family and social life formed the bedrock of Malian culture. Extended families lived together in compounds, with multiple generations sharing responsibilities for farming, trade, and childcare. Elders commanded deep respect, their wisdom guiding decisions and their blessings considered essential for prosperity. Marriage was both a union of individuals and of families, often sealed with ceremonies rich in music, dance, and feasting. Children were raised not only by parents but by the entire community, taught values of cooperation, honor, and resilience. Social life was communal. Markets served as gathering places where news was shared, disputes settled, and friendships forged. In Mali, the sense of belonging extended beyond bloodlines. It was about being part of a community, a living fabric where every individual was a vital thread. This communal spirit gave Mali its strength, ensuring that even as kingdoms rose and fell, the cultural heartbeat of its people endured. If there was one element that defined the emotional soul of the Mali Empire, it was music. The sound of drums, flutes, balafons, and above all, the koratha shimmering 21-string harp filled the air in villages and royal courts alike. Music was not mere entertainment. It was a living prayer, a pulse that bound people together in joy, grief, and celebration. Drums called warriors to battle, yet the same rhythms could summon communities to harvest festivals. The griots, with their voices rising above the pluck of the kora, carried not only stories, but emotions, laughter, sorrow, pride, and hope. Every melody was an echo of history. Every rhythm a reminder that Mali's culture was as much about sound and feeling as it was about power and wealth. To listen to Malian music was to hear the empire itself breathing. Alive through song. Dance was the natural partner of music, a language of the body that expressed what words could not. In open courtyards beneath the blazing sun or the moonlit night, dancers moved with a raw energy that mirrored the cycles of life, birth, struggle, triumph, and death. Masks carved from sacred wood transformed dancers into spiritual beings, blurring the boundary between the human and divine. Each movement told a story, the swaying steps of women celebrating a successful harvest, the thunderous stomps of warriors reenacting ancient battles, the graceful spins of youths honoring the ancestors. Dance was never random. It was a coded tradition, an inheritance passed through generations. To witness, it was to glimpse the invisible threads tying Mali's people to their past, to their gods, and to one another. Religion and spirituality gave deeper meaning to these artistic expressions. Islam provided Mali with mosques, Quranic schools, and the unifying framework of a great faith, yet traditional beliefs infused daily life with symbolism. Amulets inscribed with verses of the Quran were worn for protection, while offerings to ancestral spirits were made in times of crisis. The Malians saw no contradiction in this dual devotion. Instead, they embraced it as balance. A child might learn Arabic letters in a madrasa during the day and listen to stories of ancestral spirits by the fire at night. Festivals combined Quranic recitation with traditional dance, binding together to spiritual worlds. In Mali, religion was not about division, it was about harmony. A cultural symphony that acknowledged both the seen and the unseen. Architecture, too, carried this symbolic blend of beauty and belief. The Sudanasahelian style, with its smooth, mud-plastered walls and protruding wooden beams, was not only practical for the hot climate, but spiritual in essence. The wooden stakes, or torin, that jutted from mosque walls symbolized both strength and the unity of community. As the annual replastering of these structures required entire villages to work together. Cities like Timbuktu and Djenné became living works of art, where palaces, mosques, and homes reflected a fusion of faith and environment. These were not cold monuments, they were breathing, living spaces maintained by the hands of generations, infused with prayer, tradition, and collective pride. Each structure was a statement that Mali's culture was not transient, but enduring. Rooted deeply in the earth itself, perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Malian culture is that it never truly disappeared. Though the empire fell centuries ago, its traditions live on in modern West Africa. The griots still sing the epic of Sundiata, their choras echoing across villages much as they did in the 13th century. The great Mosque of Djenné still rises from the earth, replastered by villagers in an annual ritual of community spirit. Music and dance from Mali have traveled the globe, influencing genres from blues to jazz, carried by rhythms that crossed oceans during the darkest chapters of history, and the manuscripts of Timbuktu, rescued from fire and conflict, remind the world that Africa has always been a land of wisdom, scholarship, and creativity. The cultural heartbeat of Mali did not fade with its empire. It survives in every note, every story, every prayer, whispered across the lands once ruled by the Lion King's economy. At the core of Mali's greatness lay not only its kings and scholars, but the vast wealth of its land and resources. The empire's geography was a blessing, straddling the fertile floodplains of the Niger River, the grassy savannas, and the mineral-rich lands of the south. These zones provided a natural balance of abundance: fields for crops, pastures for livestock, and mines for gold. Gold was Mali's lifeblood, the shimmering metal that turned the empire into a legend whispered across deserts and oceans. The Bambouk, Bure, and Galam mines supplied endless streams of nuggets and dust, carried in baskets and traded for salt, cloth, and exotic goods. To outsiders, Mali seemed like an endless fountain of wealth, a kingdom where gold literally grew from the soil. Yet the secret of Mali's economy was not only in extraction, it was in its mastery of movement. The empire was positioned like a bridge, connecting the riches of sub-Saharan Africa to the markets of North Africa. The Middle East and beyond, agriculture formed the daily heartbeat of the empire, sustaining its population and grounding its prosperity. Along the banks of the Niger, fertile soils produced rice, millet, sorghum, and beans, ensuring that Mali's cities and armies never went hungry. Seasonal floods replenished the land, while irrigation techniques expanded cultivation beyond the river's natural reach. Farming was a communal effort, families working side by side, guided by rhythms of the seasons and traditions passed down through generations. Beyond grains, herders raised cattle, goats, and sheep, providing milk, meat, and leather. Fishing in the Niger added yet another dimension, with nets cast at dawn and dusk. pulling in catches that fed both villages and markets. Agriculture may not have dazzled foreign travelers like gold did, but it was the true backbone of Mali's economy. The quiet strength that made the empire resilient and self-sufficient. If agriculture was the backbone, trade was the bloodstream. Mali thrived as the central hub of trans-Saharan trade. The vast network of caravans that carried goods across the desert like veins pumping lifeblood into distant lands. Salt caravans from the Sahara were especially vital. Salt was as precious as gold in medieval times, essential for preserving food and maintaining health in a hot climate. In return for salt, Mali exported gold, ivory, kola nuts, and slaves. Commodities that flowed northward to markets in Cairo, Tunis, and Marrakesh. The caravans were monumental undertakings, thousands of camels laden with goods, guided by Berber and Tuareg traders, enduring weeks of blistering heat and shifting sands. These routes connected Mali to the Mediterranean world, making its wealth known in the courts of Europe and Asia. Through trade, Mali was not an isolated kingdom, it was an artery in the body of global commerce. Markets within Mali's cities reflected this vibrant exchange of goods and cultures. In Timbuktu, Djenné, and Niani, marketplaces bustled with activity, women selling grains and vegetables, smiths hammering iron tools, weavers displaying dyed cloth, and merchants from distant lands trading spices, books, and ornaments. These markets were more than centers of commerce, they were theaters of life, where news was shared, alliances formed, and cultures blended. The sound of bargaining, the sight of colorful fabrics, the smell of roasted meats and fresh fish created an atmosphere that was at once economic and social. In these markets, one could find not only food and clothing, but ideas, religious teachings, scientific theories, and artistic inspirations that traveled along with goods. Mali's economy was therefore never just material, it was intellectual and cultural, a web where wealth and wisdom intertwined. The wealth generated from Mali's resources and trade was carefully managed by its rulers, who used it to build armies, sponsor scholars, and commission grand architectural works. Gold paid for soldiers' wages, funded the construction of mosques and palaces, and sustained the caravan networks that tied the empire to the wider world. Tribute flowed into the imperial treasury from provinces and subject states, binding them to the empire through economic dependence. Taxes were levied on goods passing through Mali's borders, turning the empire into a toll gate of global commerce. This system created stability, but also immense prestige. To the outside world, Mali was a kingdom where streets were lined with wealth, where kings could spend gold as though it were sand, and where abundance seemed endless. The economy of Mali was not simply a foundation for survival, was the very reason the empire became legendary. Its riches echoing across centuries of history. Beyond gold and agriculture, Mali's wealth was reflected in the craftsmanship and industries that flourished within its borders. Blacksmiths were revered as more than simple metalworkers. They were seen as keepers of sacred knowledge, capable of transforming earth into tools, weapons, and art. Their forges produced iron hoes for farming, spears and swords for warriors, and ornate jewelry that adorned the nobility. Leather workers crafted saddles, shoes, and armor, while weavers spun cotton and dyed fabrics in brilliant hues of indigo, producing textiles that traveled as far as Morocco and Egypt. Each craft was more than an economic activity, was a cultural expression, linking the empire's identity to its material creations. Workshops in Mali's cities hummed with the rhythm of artisans at work, shaping goods that carried the empire's essence into distant markets. Currency in the Mali Empire took multiple forms, reflecting both local traditions and global interactions. Gold dust was the most common medium of exchange within the empire. Carefully measured in small containers, often carried in pouches tied around the waist. For larger transactions, gold ingots or slabs were used. Though the empire famously forbade its kings from exporting gold nuggets, ensuring that the empire's wealth remained secure. Cowrie shells, imported from the Indian Ocean, also circulated widely, especially in smaller markets and rural areas. These shells, shimmering like miniature jewels, symbolized wealth and status even among commoners. The dual system of gold and cowries tied Mali into two worlds at once: the vast Islamic trade routes of North Africa and the Indian Ocean, commercial networks that stretched to India and beyond. Integration into the broader Islamic economy magnified Mali's global reach. By the 13th and 14th centuries, Mali had become not only a supplier of gold, but also a participant in a shared commercial and religious system stretching from West Africa to Arabia, Persia, and even China. Pilgrims traveling to Mecca carried Mali's goods alongside their prayers, embedding the empire's economic reputation into the heart of the Muslim world. Traders from Egypt and the Maghreb eagerly sought Mali's gold, while bringing back salt, horses, textiles, and luxury goods. The empire's cities became cosmopolitan, where North African scholars debated theology in the same streets where desert caravans unloaded their wares. Mali's wealth thus became inseparable from its identity as part of a greater Islamic world bound together not only by faith, but by commerce. The wealth of Mali dazzled outsiders, inspiring awe and sometimes disbelief. One of the most famous examples came during the reign of Mansa Musa, whose legendary pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 sent shockwaves through the global economy. As Musa passed through Cairo, he distributed so much gold that he reportedly caused inflation lasting over a decade. Chroniclers from Egypt to Spain marveled at the scale of his caravan, which included thousands of attendants, slaves, and camels laden with gold dust and treasures. To the Mediterranean world, Musa's journey was not merely religious, it was an economic revelation. A demonstration that the richest man in history ruled from West Africa. Mali's fame spread across maps, European courts, and Arab chronicles, transforming the empire into a symbol of unearthly prosperity. Yet, beneath the glitter of gold, the empire's economy was always a delicate balance of abundance and vulnerability. The same trade routes that enriched Mali also exposed it to external pressures: raiders seeking wealth, rival empires competing for influence, and shifting patterns of commerce that could reroute prosperity elsewhere. Gold was abundant, but it was finite. Agricultural surpluses fed cities, but droughts or poor harvests could weaken the empire's core. Mali's rulers had to manage not only the material flow of wealth, but the perception of endless abundance that outsiders expected. In time, this tension between reality and legend would become a source of strain, as Mali's economy faced both internal challenges and external envy. Still, in its golden age, Mali's industries, markets, and global connections made it one of the most extraordinary economic powers of the medieval world. The Mali Empire's rulers understood that wealth was not just about resources, was about control. At the height of its power, the empire stretched across a vast region of West Africa, encompassing diverse peoples, cultures, and landscapes. To hold such a domain together, the emperors implemented a sophisticated system of taxation and tribute. Provinces and vassal states were required to send annual contributions of gold, grain, cattle, and slaves to the capital. Caravans crossing through Mali's territory were taxed at every checkpoint, creating a steady stream of revenue from the trans-Saharan trade. These taxes were not arbitrary. They were carefully organized, with officials appointed to oversee collection and prevent fraud. The system not only enriched the imperial treasury, but also reinforced loyalty, reminding local rulers that their prosperity was tied to the central authority of the Mansa tribute from conquered lands. Further cemented Mali's economic dominance. Territories brought under imperial control were often allowed to keep their traditions and local leaders. But in return, they owed allegiance and tribute to Mali's throne, This system of indirect rule was pragmatic, allowing Mali to expand without overstretching its administrative apparatus. From the Songhai in the east to the Wolof in the west, goods flowed into the empire: livestock, ivory, hides, and even warriors to serve in the imperial army. The tribute system not only expanded Mali's economic base, but also created a sense of imperial grandeur. To outsiders, the Mansa was not merely a king. He was a ruler of rulers, a sovereign who commanded both wealth and obedience across an empire of dazzling scale. Yet, like the shifting sands of the Sahara, trade routes and economic fortunes were never permanent. Over time, the trans-Saharan routes that had carried Mali's wealth to North Africa began to decline. By emerging coastal trade with European powers. The Portuguese and other Europeans who arrived on West Africa's Atlantic shores in the 15th century introduced new pathways of commerce, bypassing the desert caravans that had sustained Mali for centuries. Gold, ivory, and eventually slaves flowed directly into European ships, weakening the empire's monopoly on trade. The gradual erosion of Mali's economic centrality did not happen overnight, but it set the stage for decline. As rival states like Songhai adapted more effectively to the changing dynamics of global commerce, as the trans-Saharan trade faltered, so too did Mali's internal economic stability. Provinces that once depended on imperial protection and trade revenues began asserting independence, reducing tribute payments and withholding resources. The empire's treasury shrank, making it harder to maintain large armies or fund monumental projects. The fragile balance between agriculture, mining, and trade was disrupted, exposing the empire to droughts, raids, and famine. What had once been the richest empire in Africa found itself grappling with scarcity and competition. The legends of Mali's inexhaustible gold persisted in the minds of outsiders. But within the empire's borders, reality was far more complex. Prosperity was slipping away, grain by grain, coin by coin. Despite its eventual decline, the economic legacy of Mali endures as one of the most remarkable in history. The empire pioneered models of taxation, tribute, and trade regulation that influenced future states in West Africa. Its gold-fueled economies far beyond its borders, influencing the rise of Mediterranean cities and even shaping Europe's appetite for African riches in later centuries. The stories of markets in Timbuktu, the wealth of Mansa Musa, and the glittering caravans across the Sahara became part of global imagination, immortalizing Mali as a land of plenty. In truth, Mali's economy was not a miracle. It was the product of human ingenuity, resource management, and the courage to connect distant worlds through commerce. Long after the empire's fall, the economic heartbeat of Mali echoes in West Africa's marketplaces, where trade, resilience, and community remain as enduring as the golden age of this empire. Current situation: the story of Mali did not end with the fall of the medieval empire. It continued through centuries of transformation, resilience, and reinvention. The land once ruled by emperors like Sundiata and Musa eventually fractured into smaller kingdoms, each carrying fragments of the old glory. By the late 19th century, Mali, then part of the vast Sahelian belt, fell under the shadow of European imperialism. The French seized control, folding it into French West Africa, where it was renamed the French Sudan. Colonial rule disrupted traditional governance and trade, reorienting the region's economy toward French needs. Roads, schools, and administrative systems were built, but often at the expense of local autonomy and cultural continuity. The brilliance of the Mali Empire became a memory, a story passed down in songs and folktales, while the people endured decades of foreign rule. Yet beneath colonial suppression, the spirit of independence simmered, waiting for the right moment to reawaken. That moment arrived in the mid-20th century as waves of decolonization swept across Africa. Inspired by nationalist movements and emboldened by a growing intellectual class, the people of Mali demanded freedom. In 1960, the Republic of Mali was born, with Modibo Keita as its first president. The birth of the new nation was greeted with hope, pride, and a sense of historic justice. The descendants of an empire that had once dominated Africa had reclaimed their sovereignty. But the challenges were immense. Mali was landlocked, its economy underdeveloped, its infrastructure fragile. Keita envisioned a socialist path, emphasizing state control of resources and Pan-African unity. Yet political unrest and economic struggles led to a coup in 1968, ushering in decades of instability. From the start, modern Mali's story was one of promise and hardship intertwined. Geography has always shaped Mali's destiny, both in ancient and modern times. The country is vast, stretching from the Sahara Desert in the north to fertile river valleys in the south. This diversity is a double-edged sword. It provides rich farmland and water resources in some areas, but vast arid regions in others that are vulnerable to droughts and famine. Climate challenges, particularly desertification and unpredictable rainfall, have made agriculture the livelihood of most Malians precarious. Furthermore, Mali is a mosaic of ethnic groups: the Bambara, Fulani, Tuareg, Songhai, Dogon, and others. Each community contributes to the nation's cultural richness, but also brings unique aspirations, traditions, and at times, tensions. Balancing this diversity while building a shared national identity has proven to be one of Mali's greatest challenges since independence. Politics in modern Mali have often been turbulent, marked by coups, authoritarian regimes, and fragile democracies. After the long rule of Mansa Musa, who seized power in 1968, Mali experienced widespread protests demanding reform. In 1991, his regime was toppled, and a new democratic constitution was established. For a time, Mali was hailed as a model of democracy in West Africa, with peaceful elections and relative stability. But beneath the surface, economic inequality, corruption, and growing insecurity simmered. The promise of democracy was fragile, threatened by the weight of history and the harsh realities of modern governance. Mali's leaders struggled to reconcile the dream of national unity with the deep complexities of regional, ethnic, and economic divides. Today, Mali finds itself at a crossroads, a nation of extraordinary heritage facing modern struggles that test its resilience. Its colonial scars, geographic challenges, and political instability form a difficult backdrop. Yet its people continue to endure with remarkable strength. The echoes of the ancient empire live on, not in golden caravans, but in the pride of Mali's citizens who remember that their ancestors built one of the greatest civilizations in human history. Modern Mali's current situation cannot be understood without its past: the rise of empires, the trauma of colonization, and the hard-won independence that defines its identity today. The question that lingers is whether Mali, like its legendary empire, can once again find a path to stability, prosperity, and global recognition. The modern history of Mali has been scarred by conflict, much of it rooted in the tensions between the north and the south. In the arid lands of the Sahara, the Tuareg people, proud nomadic communities who have roamed the desert for centuries, felt marginalized by the central government in Bamako. Since independence, the Tuareg repeatedly demanded greater autonomy, arguing that their traditions and economic needs were ignored by a state dominated by southern groups. These tensions erupted into a series of rebellions, beginning in the 1960s and flaring up again in the 1990s and 2000s. Each time, peace accords were signed, but the underlying grievances, poverty, neglect, and lack of representation remained unresolved. The north of Mali became a symbol of unfulfilled promises, a region where the desert's silence hid deep wounds of mistrust. The crisis escalated dramatically in 2012, when Tuareg rebels launched a powerful uprising, seizing control of vast swaths of northern Mali. Their cause was soon hijacked by extremist groups linked to al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, Akim, and other jihadist factions who exploited the chaos to impose their harsh version of Sharia law. Ancient shrines and manuscripts in Timbuktu, symbols of Mali's cultural heritage, were destroyed in acts that shocked the world. The once proud city of learning became a battleground, its mosques scarred by conflict, its people terrorized. For Mali, it was not just a territorial loss, it was a wound to its very soul. A reminder that its cultural treasures and national pride were vulnerable in the face of instability. The Malian state, overwhelmed and fractured, called for international assistance. In 2013, France launched Operation Serval, a military intervention that quickly pushed back the extremists and retook major northern cities. The French presence was hailed by many Malians as salvation, but it also underscored the fragility of Mali's sovereignty. Peacekeepers from the United Nations soon followed, forming one of the largest and most dangerous missions in the world. Yet, while international forces regained territory, it could not heal the deeper fractures: poverty, corruption, and the lack of trust between communities. Militants regrouped, launching deadly attacks on both soldiers and civilians, spreading violence across Mali and into neighboring countries like Burkina Faso and Niger. The cycle of instability fueled political turmoil in Bamako. Frustration with the government's failure to bring peace led to repeated coups, the most recent in 2020 and 2021, when the military seized power, promising security but delivering uncertainty. Mali's democratic experiment, once praised as a model, has been derailed, leaving citizens caught between weak civilian governments and ambitious military rulers. At the same time, resentment toward foreign troops has grown. While France initially helped Mali regain territory, its long-term presence sparked protests and accusations of neo-colonialism. In 2022, Mali's junta government expelled French forces, turning instead to Russian mercenaries from the Wagner Group, a move that alarmed Western nations and reshaped Mali's alliances. For ordinary Malians, these geopolitical struggles translate into daily hardships. Terrorist attacks remain frequent, especially in the north and central regions, displacing millions and devastating livelihoods. Villages are caught in the crossfire between jihadists, militias, and government forces. Food insecurity deepens as farmers abandon their lands, while drought and climate change exacerbate suffering. Education and healthcare systems struggle to function amid the chaos, leaving a generation at risk of being lost to instability. Yet, even in these dark times, the spirit of resilience persists. Local communities organize for peace. Elders mediate. Disputes and cultural traditions continue to be practiced as a form of resistance to despair. Mali today stands at a precarious crossroads, struggling to find balance between security, sovereignty, survival in a world that seems to circle ever closer with both hope and peril. In the global arena, Mali today occupies a paradoxical position. On one hand, it is celebrated as the heir to one of Africa's greatest civilizations, a land whose name still evokes images of golden caravans and scholarly cities. On the other, it is ranked among the world's poorest countries, struggling with insecurity, political instability, and humanitarian crises. Mali is landlocked, heavily dependent on foreign aid, and vulnerable to the shifting interests of global powers. Yet its cultural reputation, forged during the height of the Mali Empire, continues to shape how the world perceives it. International organizations, historians, and artists frequently invoke Mali's golden age as both a reminder of past greatness and a challenge to restore stability in the present. The world looks to Mali with a mixture of nostalgia and concern, torn between admiration for its history and worry for its fragile present. One of Mali's greatest challenges lies in reconciling security with sovereignty. The withdrawal of French forces and the arrival of Russian mercenaries symbolize a broader geopolitical struggle, where Mali has become a stage for international rivalries. Western nations see Mali as part of the fight against terrorism, while Mali's leaders seek to assert independence from old colonial ties. At the same time, regional organizations like ECOWA's Economic Community of West African States pressure Mali to return to democratic governance, threatening sanctions if it does not comply. This balancing act between security needs, global alliances, and domestic aspirations defines Mali's position in the 21st century. The choices made in Bamako resonate far beyond its borders, influencing the entire Sahel region, where instability spreads like a wildfire across fragile states. Despite these struggles, Mali's people remain deeply connected to the land, to their traditions, and to their history. In villages along the Niger River, farmers still plant millet and rice as their ancestors did centuries ago. In the markets of Bamako, artisans hammer iron, weave indigo cloth, and carve wood, carrying forward crafts that once filled the streets of Timbuktu and Djenné. Musicians play the kora, singing stories of the old kings, reminding audiences that Mali is more than its crisis. It is a nation of resilience, creativity, and memory. The oral traditions of the griots, who have preserved Mali's history for generations, now serve as a moral compass, reminding the nation that its identity is not defined by foreign interventions or military juntas, but by a cultural heritage that remains unbroken. The future of Mali rests on its ability to harness this cultural strength while addressing its modern challenges. Economic diversification, investment in agriculture, and regional cooperation will be vital in reducing dependence on aid and foreign powers. Education, too, is a key. Just as the medieval Mali Empire became a beacon of knowledge, modern Mali must cultivate its youth to rebuild a society that values wisdom over violence, unity over division. Climate adaptation programs are increasingly essential, as the desert encroaches on farmland and droughts threaten livelihoods. Mali's greatest test is not only to defeat insurgents or stabilize politics, it is to create hope, to inspire its citizens to see beyond hardship, and to believe that, like their ancestors, they can build a world admired beyond their borders. And so, Mali's story comes full circle. From the golden empires of the past to the fragile nation of today, the thread that ties it all together is resilience. The Mali Empire once dazzled the world with its wealth, but its true legacy was never just gold, was the power of knowledge, culture, and community. Modern Mali may not command the same riches or armies, but it still carries within its soil and its people the spirit of greatness. The Niger River still flows, the mosques of Timbuktu still stand, and the griots still sing. In those songs lies both memory and prophecy, that Mali, though tested by time, has the strength to rise again. The world watches, the desert waits, and the future remains unwritten. But if history has taught us anything, it is this: Mali is more than a nation. It is a story, and stories, like rivers, never truly end. This was the story of the Mali Empire. And you're watching Historic Horizon TV, where history lives forever.